Students, welcome to your first presentation that is about the trees, and I apologize that we have to do it like this instead of in person. And in class, I will give you or pass around samples of many of these things to look at, twigs and buds and leaves and wood and all sorts of random things. So look forward to that on Wednesday. Just as an aside, there are some test your knowledge quizzes in the Brightspace portal. If you check under the quizzes in coursework, you'll see a whole bunch of them listed there that can help you practice for the field work. And don't fret about your last week's scores. You have plenty of time to improve your tree identification grade. And we will have the quiz based on last week's materials in class on Wednesday. So with that, let's get started with our first family, Sapindaceae, and the maples. Start off by introducing the genus Acer. Acer has 200 species, give or take. There's probably some more. Most of these species, 2/3 of them, are in Asia, and the other third are in North America. Well, maybe not all of them. Some of them are in other places like Europe, but North America has 13 species, and most of them are eastern trees, and they are trees and shrubs. This genus is one of the most important genera in the United States. And if you think about just how many maples we have in New York, the red maple and the sugar maple making up 50% of the trees in our forests, and then all the trees that we plant in our landscapes, in front of our homes and on our streets, and all the uses that we have for them. So they're important in the landscape, important timber trees, wildlife eat them, we get maple syrup out of them, and they're also part of our recreation and tourism when you think of all the leaf peepers that will be out in the next couple weeks, touring around, looking at all the pretty leaves. I just want to introduce you to a few species that I'm not really going to go over in detail that are not native to the United States, that you'll run into occasionally: hammer maple, hedge maple, and sycamore maple. I am going to cover one that is not native, but it is an important one in the US, the Norway maple, which is considered an invasive one, and a common ornamental one, the Japanese maple. Here's a picture of the Japanese maple on the right, and they often are this kind of reddish purple leaf, though there are some with green leaves. And you can see that this is also Acer palmatum atropurpureum. Think for a second. And that is the variety name, the cultivar name for this ornamental variety. And there's a rhododendron blooming to the left of it there. Like I said, this is a somewhat common ornamental tree, and so this is one, every so often I'm going to introduce you to plants that you should just know are around. You know, we're not going to quiz on this, and I'm not going to ask you to really be able to identify it, but this is what it is. And when we talk about maples as a genus, you know, we've talked about that most of them are lobed, and if you look at the leaf, it looks very similar to a silver maple. Deeply cut lobes. These are smaller leaves usually. Sometimes they are, there's even more lobes, but there you go. For our native trees, we're going to cover red, silver, and sugar maples, as well as box elder, black maple, and bigleaf maple, and mountain maple and striped maple. And I have them grouped in those three different slides because the first one was the kind of the most important, the large trees, and then the secondary importance, and then these ones are like shrubs. So let's get started with sugar maple. And in your workbooks, you should have seen that there was a sheet for Acer, and you could have written down all the things that I just said, and you can go back and re-listen to those little things that I said and write them down. Or pause this for a moment and do it now. You should see an individual page for each of the trees I'm going to go over. And so find the sugar maple. It should be the first tree in your book, and you'll see at the top it says Sapindaceae Acer saccharum, and feel free to write the common name sugar maple underneath it. And just like we talked about the range, the importance of um, environmental conditions on where trees grow, here's the range map that is a result of the tree's environmental conditions. And so sugar maple is a relatively common tree of the northeastern United States. So it goes up into New England, the Lake States, southern Canada, and then drops down into Tennessee, Kentucky, a little bit of spotty populations outside of that. I'm not going to ask you to tell me every single state where we find sugar maple, but I might ask you where in general in the United States do we find this tree? Is it a northeastern tree? Is it an eastern tree? Is it southeastern? Is it a Pacific Northwest? And so you should have a generalized idea of where the trees are, where they're native to when it comes to the quizzes. Sugar maple is probably the most well-known and popular maple. Maple in general is the national tree symbol of Canada, and we can debate whether that maple that's on there is a sugar maple or a red maple. But it is also the state tree. Sugar maple is the state tree of New York and of Vermont. It is also one of the most abundant and one of the most valuable trees in New York State. So a few distinguishing characteristics, just to remind you what it looks like. There are 3 major lobes. Typically, you might say 5, depending on how you look at it. The leaf's relatively broad. And then the lobes are palmately arranged, as well as the venation of the leaf. And it's kind of a medium green. The buds are long and brown and pointed, imbricately scaled, so they have the layered bud scales on them. And then the laterals are similar, just a little bit smaller and oppressed, tied up to the twig. You can see the lenticels, those dots on the twig, though many trees have them on young trees, and so we're not on young twigs, and so we're not necessarily focusing on that. Here's a nice example of a fall color for our sugar maples. They can be red, yellow, orange, or kind of all 3 at once, and are commonly planted and sought after because of their beautiful fall color. Most of the trees that we'll cover in this class, we don't have a good opportunity to see the flowers out in the field because they flower at other times of the year. So these are the maple flowers, and you have probably seen them and never really thought about them. Most maples have flowers that have a structure similar to this. These kind of drooping clusters of flowers. The sugar maple ones are kind of a lightish yellow color. Here they are up close. And these are the maple samaras. So this is a paired samara. There's a seed, and the bulky part at the top that's still green in this picture. The seed is there, and there's a papery wing, which helps the combined samara flutter away from the tree as like a little helicopter. The size and shape of the samaras are distinct for each maple, and I'll show you a collection of them in class on Wednesday. Here's the mature bark. We have this kind of long, platy, grayish bark, kind of curls at the edges. And you can see the white patches of lichen on this. Remember, lichen is the same kind of thing that you find growing on rocks. Doesn't affect the tree, but often we see it on the tree and might affect what we perceive to be the bark color. But typically this kind of grayish, tannish, well, I don't know, light brown, gray, whatever. But long plates that curl at the edges. And younger trees are typically going to have a smooth bark that is that same kind of grayish color. So where do sugar maples grow? We've talked about this, right? They are found in good sites. They are found on mesic sites, which means middle, so not too wet and not too dry. So they are what we call site sensitive. They don't like the very dry and the very wet. They prefer moist, rich, well-drained sites. Well-drained means that it doesn't hold water. This is a phrase that we sometimes say, the tree or the plant doesn't like to have their feet wet. So they don't want to have their roots kind of standing in water. Here is a typical example of a sugar maple stand. This is our woodlot out at Sadaf, so some of you might be familiar with this. This picture is probably 18 years old or so, so this is a time a time before many of you. Sugar maple is one of the main components of our maple beech birch cover type. And in the picture there, you can see the sugar maple on the right and a white ash on the left. Our maple beech birch cover type is not just those 3 trees, right? We talked about this the other day, that is code for the suite of trees that make up the standard forest. And so things like white ash, black cherry, beech, basswood, bitternut hickory, hemlock, white pine, red maple. There's a whole bunch that grow in the same spaces as the sugar maple. This is also kind of a typical scene where we have just one big remnant sugar maple that's been left over from an earlier era, and then the sugar maple stand has populated around it. They are prolific seeders. In good years, they can push out 8 million seeds per acre if you have an acre of trees. But 8 million seeds is a lot of seeds. And they have a high germination rate. So that means a lot of them will sprout. And the seedlings are persistent. They will survive in the understory for a long time until they get a little bit of light so they can be released. And that's part of the strategy of the sugar maple as a shade-tolerant species. One problem that we have is that deer really like these trees, and so often we'll see a carpet of sugar maple seedlings, but they never get much taller than that because the deer browse them back. And some of those little seedlings might be many years old and they've just never been able to grow. This tree is considered to have a moderate growth rate. So if we were to measure twig growth on the outside of the canopy, it might have 8 inches of 8 inches of growth each year, 6 to 8 inches. So they can put on a fair bit, but not as fast as some of our other trees. As I mentioned before, these are considered very tolerant trees of shade and competition. And as such, we find them in succession in the mid to late end. So they will perpetuate themselves in a shady environment and shade out some of those less tolerant species. They do have a few limiting factors. And given that this tree is so prevalent, there's lots of opportunity for things to attack it. And so we commonly find canker, which is what this is a picture of, Eutypella canker, sugar maple borer, which is a native insect. Factor, so extreme or poor site conditions, people might try to plant them in places because they know they're a valuable tree that aren't well suited for those trees, and so the sugar maple will die on that site. And climate change and global warming is a consideration that we have. It'll take a long time before the effects of it are felt in New York when it comes to the sugar maple, but we are already losing sugar maple out of the bottom end of its range, and it's moving north. And so as the climate continues to warm, we will have fewer sugar maples in the south and more moving north, and they'll move out of New York eventually. This is an example of sugar maple borer. The insect itself, the larva, feeds under the bark on the cambial layer and kills like a line across the middle. And so you can see that kind of smile. It almost looks like a piece of wire has been trapped in the tree, and that is the impact of the sugar maple borer. And we typically find that when the site is already stressed or there's too many stems per acre and the trees are stressed. So it's considered a secondary pest, but it's not good for wood quality. It can lead to decay. It's not hugely problematic depending on what our management goals are. Speaking of management goals, we have lots of options here, or we use it for lots of things. And so the wood, this is one of our most prized woods. It has hard, heavy, strong wood, which is light colored and fine grained. And so you can't, there is subtle differences between the early wood and the late wood. This is a ring porous, no, it is not. It is a diffuse porous species. And so the coloration is pretty bland. We have, so the wood itself is used for furniture, for flooring. We make all sorts of things out of it. So we use it for durable goods. If you're making it into a floor, you want that floor to be able to withstand shoes and dropping and things like that. And your furniture to be able to withstand use. So it's one of our most valuable hardwoods. There are also some special grain patterns. So we're looking at bird's eye maple here. And when we have these kind of special grain patterns, we don't know that the tree has produced them until we cut them open. And so we can't look at the tree from the outside and be like, oh, this one's curly or has bird's eye. So they're kind of like a surprise. But these boards with these figures are worth even more. And they typically are used for more ornate things. And so, like for example, violins or gun stocks or decorative pieces. This is curly. It's also called fiddleback or flame maple. And here it is on the back of a string instrument. It's pretty. It's also an important tree for wildlife. And so things do eat the seeds. They certainly do, but we often consider its importance to be in the twigs that animals browse. So many species of herbivores, right, eat the twigs and the leaves. And as these trees can be quite old, 300 to 400 years old, as they start to break down a little bit, they might get cavities. And so there's often cavities in the trees that animals take advantage of. And so they can be kind of useful. In many woodlots, they're one of the largest and biggest trees. I said that the same way. They're one of the largest and oldest trees because often some were left at the farmstead and then newer trees grew around it when those farmlands were abandoned. Something you might consider or know a little bit about is maple sugar production. And so I will ask you on Wednesday how many of you are involved in maple sugaring. And this is a really common activity in the Northeast. The technique is we drill holes into the tree and we collect the sap that comes out. The sap, when it's harvested, has 2 to 7% sugar. And then we boil that sap down and boil a lot of the extra water off until we get it to be about 66% sugar, which is the removal of a lot of water. It usually takes 40 to 60 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup, depending on the initial sugar content. The generalized concept was learned from the Native Americans, and so this is something that has been practiced for a very long time in the Northeast. So the previous slide was bucket collection, and this is a more modern method with tubing. There are other other maple species that we can collect sap from. Red maple is one of them. They tend to bud out earlier, which affects the flavor of the syrup. And some of the others, it's not necessarily worth doing because of the sugar content. So just a review of the importance. This is an ornamental as well as a forest tree. So it's an important landscape tree, prized for many reasons. It's an ecotourism tree in the Northeast. People spend money to drive around and stay in areas with pretty maple trees, as well as all of its forest uses. This past week, you were introduced to black maple, Acer nigrum, and this is that very similar looking tree that's a little more west central. It's not as common in the Northeast. You can see it on the map. We have it in spots in New York, but in those areas, it's not very, even though the range is in New York, it's not very common in those places. It tends to be more on limestone soils. And the distribution increases as you go to the west. It may or may not be a distinct species from sugar maple. To distinguish it from sugar maple, typically we have 3-lobed leaves. The buds are a little fuzzy. The bark is darker and rougher. And the leaves are a little bit fuzzy or downy on the back, kind of a yellowish color. It is relatively similar to sugar maple in where it grows, although it will grow in slightly drier and slightly wetter sites. And it does hybridize with sugar maple where the ranges overlap. Its economic importance is similar to sugar maple. One thing I forgot to mention is so when we talk about maples, we often group them by kind of their wood density. And so we have a term that we call hard maple and another term we call soft maple. And hard maples are sugar maple and black maple. Their wood is very similar and can be used interchangeably. The soft maples are things like red maple and silver maple and box elder. And again, those woods are all similar and can be used interchangeably. Some people like to clarify and say that soft maple is like the common name for another common name for red maple, but it's actually a group of lumber. But you will have people that refer to hard maple in that they're meaning sugar maple. So just kind of lodge that in your mind. And speaking of red maple, here it is. Sapindaceae acer rubrum. This is a really widespread tree. Like I just mentioned, sometimes it's called soft maple. It's called swamp maple occasionally. Apparently some people call it scarlet maple. Really the only ones I hear are red maple and soft maple. But this is a very common and widespread tree. You can see it's an eastern tree. It drops much further down south, almost all the way to the bottom of Florida, than the sugar maple. And relatively far into the Midwest. This is our most widely distributed maple from a north to south perspective, and so it has the largest range north to south. It typically has 3 lobes. There are teeth along the margin of the leaf and V-shaped sinuses, and those teeth along the margins can help you distinguish it from sugar maple, especially when the tree is small and has smooth bark, as pictured in this picture, because the bark of the sugar and the red look very similar when they're young. The back sides of the leaves tend to be whitish or lighter green. This picture is like especially white. And we have red roundish buds, blunt pointed, and kind of fewer scales. And you can see the reddish twigs. In the winter, the twigs often turn red. The bud shape can vary. It's just how it is. And so sometimes they're a little bit rounder, sometimes they're a little bit longer. Here's the red maple flower, smaller than our sugar maple flowers, but similar size, a similar shape. And our red maple samaras. These ones are not fully formed yet, but they are small and kind of both the wings point down. Here's a picture of a young red maple on the left, very smooth gray bark, and a white ash on the right. And here's our mature red maple with kind of scaly, in this picture a little bit flaky, but vertical scales on a red maple. Not as long as a silver maple or as shaggy as a silver maple. And we'll look at silver maple in just a minute. This is a tree that we consider to be cosmopolitan. It is at home in any environment. It lives in swamps, middle soils, dry uplands, kind of every site in between. And according to the Forest Service, the red maple grows on a wider range of soil types, textures, moisture, pH, and elevation than any other tree species in North America. And so if you came up to me and said, I want to plant a tree, but I don't know what to plant, then I can't tell you anything about my soils, I'm going to say plant a red maple because it'll probably grow there. Given it grows over such a wide geographic area and over such a wide range of site types, it has many species that you can find it growing with. So I'm not going to even try to list them all. It's in 54 different cover types, so lots of different places. When we see it growing in wet areas, we might see it with black ash, hemlock, white cedar, black gum, and oaks. But then also it's part of our maple beech birch, our northern hardwoods. So we find it with growing with red oaks and red and white oaks and white pine, things like that. It's all over the place. Here's a red maple swamp. This one's at Rogers Center in Sherburne. Here's another one at Fiddler's Green near Leland Pond. And then we'll see them all over the forest. This one flowers very early in March, and so this is one of the first trees that we will see blooming, although the flowers, as you saw earlier, are not very big. And so really what it looks like is that the trees just kind of flush red. And so if you drive by a stand or walk by, see a stand of red maple trees, it gets kind of this reddish glow. It's very pretty. And then they produce a lot of seeds in early fall, and they can be relatively prolific. Many of our hardwood trees will sprout from the stump. Red maple are really known for this, and in some cases we will intentionally regenerate a stand of red maple by encouraging those stump sprouts versus replanting or waiting for seeds to come in. And these are rapid growers. They will put on 10, 12 inches of growth every year. So unlike sugar maple, which is very tolerant, red maple is intermediate. So it likes to have a little bit of shade and a little bit of sun, but not too much of either. So because of this, we find this not the earliest in succession, but towards the early end of succession, and then it drops out as the canopy closes in later succession. And so while we can find stands of red maple, typically they transition to sugar maple after a while. Because it can grow on such a wide variety of sites, it doesn't have as many limiting factors. A really high pH can throw it off. It won't necessarily grow in those sites really. It does have a number of pests, but nothing as straightforward or significant as the sugar maple. It doesn't have any specific cankers. It just has some kind of general things. In the last 100 years, maybe a little more than that now, red maple has really transitioned from a minor component of our Maple Beach burst forests to a major forest component. And so I'm really talking about the forests of New England and around New York State. And it's shifted over the last 100 years to being a tree that we saw, not uncommonly. It was a pretty common tree still, but it wasn't the most common tree in New York State. And I want you to think about why that might be. And so some of those reasons have to do with pests. So gypsy moth, which is we now call spongy moth, favors some trees over another. And so oaks, for example, are highly favored, and it doesn't really care about maples. And so in areas that were kind of red oak, red maple stands, it would eat the oak and give the maple, the red maple, an advantage. High grading. High grading is the practice of selecting the best individual trees out of a forest for harvesting and leaving the lesser ones behind. And this isn't to be confused with single tree selection. We sometimes call this selective cutting, where we're just selecting the very best trees in a stand and leaving kind of the junkier trees behind. So red maple is sometimes considered, I shouldn't say sometimes, it is considered to be a less desirable timber tree because the wood is softer, especially compared to the sugar maple with the hardwood. And so if you were eyeing a stand for how much money you could get out of it, you might take all the sugar maple and leave the red maple. The result of this is that by removing the best genetics of our most valuable trees out of the stand, we don't have those trees being replaced. The trees that were left, the red maple, are the ones that have done the replacing. And so due to our own human actions, we've shifted the forest away from sugar maple towards red maple. Deer are also more likely to browse other trees before red maple. They certainly do eat red maple, but they'll prefer sugar maple before red. And red sprouts a lot faster and more prolifically. And so it can kind of handle a little bit more browsing. It's a really durable tree. And then there's other things like fire protection, where it lives in places that might be wet. And so not that we have a lot of forest fires around here, but it can put itself in a spot where it's not going to be burned out like an oak might be. They are very prolific seeders. They have an earlier seed crop, and they do sprout, like I said. And so they have multiple ways of regeneration. As I mentioned, soft maple is what we call the timber. And again, this is a group of trees. Red maple, silver maple, box elder, even Norway maple could be put into soft maple. We're not really harvesting that for lumber. And don't let this confuse you. And I'll bring it up a few times throughout the semester, but when we say soft, this is a comparative term. This is still a hardwood tree. The wood itself is hard. And it is just softer than sugar maple wood. It is also on the softer end of some of the other hardwoods. Many of the hardwoods, even the ones we say of soft wood, like the soft maple or things like aspen or basswood, which have soft woods, they are all hardwoods. And we have softwoods, which are conifers. Some of the conifer woods are harder than some of the hardwoods. And so these are generic categorical terms we apply. So just keep that in mind. But so we use soft maple, red maple, for low-grade timber products. So for example, we might use black cherry, which is a highly desirable wood, as the visible part of a table or cabinets, and then red maple are the hidden pieces, the sides of the drawer, the back of the piece of furniture. And so red maple is still used, but it's just not as desired, it's not as pretty, it's not quite as durable. I've already mentioned it's an important tree for wildlife. Lots of things will browse on it, and things do eat the seeds. They typically don't get quite as big or live as long as sugar maple, so we have less cavity trees, and the wood decays a little bit faster than sugar maple, so it's less of a cavity tree. It is, though, a popular ornamental tree, as you know. Just want to point this out. And so the picture on the left is a red maple leaf. The picture on the right is also a red maple leaf. You will notice that they are yellow. You can see those bright red petioles, and if we could see the buds, you'd say, oh yeah, those are red maple. And so while most of the time it is red, there are some random occurrences where we don't see red in the fall color of the red maple tree. Variation. What are you going to do? So, and then also when they start off red, but then they often fade to a kind of a pumpkin-y color and then turn brown. You know, all leaves eventually turn brown. Here are two red maples on the same site. They're wetlands. There's a very narrow red one and one that's less narrow and less red, and probably will be turning more red as the season goes on, but this is just natural variation. They are also susceptible more so to ice and snow and weather damage because of the softer wood. So just a picture of that. We're going to move on to silver maple, Acer saccharinum. And this is a common eastern tree. You'll note that it does not grow as far south as the red maple, but it grows farther west and goes well into the plains. This is a bottomland species, and so that means that it grows along rivers or other bottom areas. It does also grow in swamps. When we say bottomland, we're usually referring to like floodplains along river systems, though bottomland and wetland species would be applicable here for silver maple. It is also known as a landscape tree, though it has fallen out of favor because it tends to drop large branches as it ages. And so you still commonly see it in people's yards, but we plant it less now than we used to. And it would be considered a soft maple. It is not typically harvested because of its habitat, and it's kind of precarious to go into bottomland and wetlands areas to harvest trees. And so these are usually not harvested. And the form doesn't really bode well either. So what does it look like? 3 to 5 lobes, very deep sinuses, coarse, irregular teeth. The back side of the leaf is silvery, hence the name. And there's half of a samara there, or one of the paired samara there at the bottom of the picture. The buds do look similar to red maple. They supposedly have a rank odor when you crush them. I guess it all depends on what your opinion of rank is. They're usually a little bit more purpley, and they, in my opinion, once they're fully mature, buds tend to be more round than red maples, but some of this is comparative. Here are the flowers of red maple. You'll note there's male flowers and female flowers. And here are the samaras. They have one of the largest samaras, and similar in size to Norway maple, though Norway will be more straight across versus these droop. So a drooping mustache versus a straight mustache, but very large samaras. And when silver maple seed, these things end up everywhere. Here we have this loose, scaly, flaky bark, and so these are kind of longer horizontal scales or flakes than the red maple, and shaggier looking in general. And this is a really typical form. This is one, of course, planted in a cemetery, which is a common place to find them, but they usually have short trunks and branch out relatively low with large main leaders. And so they form this vase shape as they kind of arch over. And so one tree can really cover a lot of area. It has a huge canopy. And these trees, 80 to 90 feet tall, and they can be 80 to 90 feet wide, and so quite large. There's one in the summer, or the fall, I guess. Typically, we're going to find them in moist or seasonably wet soils. Those are soils that flood in the spring and then drain out. Floodplains, bottomlands, riparian zones of large streams and rivers. We have a few, so the range map showed silver maple growing up into the northern part of New York, but we don't have that many of them north of about where we are. And so as you go south, we really pick up a lot more of them in the Susquehanna River system, and they'll be growing natively along the edges of the streams. There are a few other bottomland trees that we will cover, and we typically find silver maple growing with box elder and river birch, and then sycamore, which is another large tree that kind of picks up, and we're again at about the northern end of its range. I think the northernmost population of sycamore is in Watertown, says someone, but those trees will carry through this more southern end of the range. So these are its common associates. It has a reproduction and growth patterns that are similar to red maple. They flower and fruit in early spring. Remember, the two trees do hybridize, and so having synchronous flowering times is important. They will also vigorously stump sprout, and they are rapid growers. They are shade intolerant. Some limiting factors: because of their broad vase shape and kind of weak wood, they're susceptible to weather damage. And then as they age, they tend to just drop large limbs, regardless of the weather. They have some significant importance for riparian ecology. And so while we're not really harvesting them very much, they are really important for bank stabilization and erosion control. They provide significant wildlife habitat in those spaces. These are long-lived trees. They're large. They will get cavities, and so they provide important habitat for like wood duck and other similar kinds of species that need cavities. And they provide a lot of shade. One tree provides a lot of shade. It does have some value as an ornamental tree. You need a big space. And like I said before, as a timber product, this is a lesser used species because of mostly where it's grown or where it grows. And then it's not the most valuable wood, so it's not necessarily worth putting in all the extra effort to go get that wood. All right, I'm going to leave it here, and I'll pick up with the rest of the maple when I see you on Wednesday in class.